to see another Democrat. Let me elaborate a little bit on good versus bad corporations. I spent my life, my professional life, 64 years. I'm 85 years old, and I started when I was 21. So I've been in the business world with big corporations and little corporations for 64 years. There are neither good nor bad corporations, mostly. It's the environment in which we have allowed them to do what they're doing to us that's the problem. That's what I want to speak to. Corporations mostly will obey the law. They'll push against it, but so do I. Speed limit's 65, how about 67? Will that work? They'll mostly obey the law. The problem is the system in which we've allowed them to run our lives. Is the speaker, is this working? Okay. You do something if I need to correct. 200 years ago, Mary Shelley engaged in a contest with 3 other authors, including Lord Byron and her husband, Percy Shelley, in a contest to see who could write the scariest horror story. Little did she know that her horror story, which won the contest, would come true in our time, but with horrific consequences. She imagined in her horror story that Dr. Frankenstein created a robot, a creature, to be a servant. But conditions changed so that servant became a monster. We have accomplished the same thing with corporations. But we have allowed them to become monsters, but of biblical proportions. In 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that corporations are persons, are people, and therefore had protection under the First Amendment of free speech, and that speech is money. And therefore, corporations, as people, can make unlimited contributions anonymously to political campaigns. Well, as a colleague of mine says, that just doesn't pass the giggle test. Corporations are not persons. I've spent over 60 years among corporations. I was vice president of one of the largest corporations in the nation. I have consulted the corporations around the world. I have written articles in many management journals and magazines. I have taught corporate managers and corporate executives and corporate managers to be. And I'm here to tell you that my cat has more human qualities than any corporation I have ever encountered in my entire life. As Doonesbury says, I'll believe a corporation is a person when Texas executes one. A corporation is not a person, it's a tool. Like a pair of pliers. It offers the possibility of leverage for good or for evil, depending on how people operate it. And money is not speech. If a cop stops you beside the road, you have the right of speech to that cop. But if you offer him money, you become a felon. You're guilty of attempted bribery. Money is simply not speech. But this decision by the Supreme Court means that corporations can legally and publicly put in office any candidate that they can afford. You can't expect to be elected. You can't even expect to run a viable campaign in today's world with the cost of publicity, and especially the cost of television, without being obligated to corporate money. The case, the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, changed the corporation which we created to serve our needs into a monster that would make Frankenstein's monster look like a Shirley Temple doll by comparison. The modern corporation, as we now know it, wasn't needed until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which began, incidentally, in the same year as the political revolution in 1776. In the agrarian millennia that preceded the Industrial Revolution, land was essentially the only capital there was. Shovels and hoes and pitchforks and rakes just didn't take much money, much capital. And there was no economy of scale. Then the Industrial Revolution hit with its economies of scale, and large amounts of money needed to be accumulated to pay for the expensive machinery, the large factories, and the massive distribution system that are the Industrial Revolution. Far more money was needed for those than any one person possessed, so we needed a device that would accumulate large amounts of capital. So we invented the modern corporation to do that, to serve mankind. Now, in order for that corporation to work so that it could accumulate the large capital that was needed, we also had to invent what we called the corporate veil, which was a protection between the investor and the corporation, so that the investor could only lose the amount of money that he had originally invested into the corporation. And if the corporation went bankrupt, he could not his resources could not be tapped. As long as that investor did not have direct control of the operation of the corporation. Therefore, we also invented a board of directors. So the investors, the stockholders, elected a board of directors to direct the corporation, to look after the investors' interest, to elect the officers, to approve all of the policies, to approve all the major expenditures, and to set the salaries and the bonuses of the officers, working essentially as employees of the stockholders. The officers who were elected by the board then followed the direction of the board, hired the employees of the company, and ran the business. And of course, the role of the government was to monitor the operation of the company and apply whatever laws and regulations were applicable. In addition, the shareholder had a watchdog. The shareholders elected what are called outside auditors, who had access to everything that went on inside the corporation, all of the activities, all of the records, all the plans. And the outside auditors who were working for the shareholders reported to the shareholders, to the board of directors, to the government, and to the public for publicly held corporations. Has that handout been around? Okay, figure 1 shows sketches out that system of accountability so that the management of the corporation is held accountable to the shareholders through the board of directors and through the outside auditors. We'll soon see in a few minutes that every one of those systems has been totally perverted. Every one of those accountability systems has been totally perverted. Now this corporate veil that separated the investors from the corporation gave the corporation sort of an air of selfhood. So we the people assigned to the corporation certain attributes that were necessary for them to serve their need, which was to accumulate the capital that was needed. For example, corporations were permitted to buy, own, and sell property. Corporations could sue and be sued. Corporations could be taxed and regulated and fined. But those attributes were very limited, the attributes that we gave the corporations. For instance, they were not allowed to vote. Corporations are not allowed to hold public office. They were not allowed to serve or be drafted into the military. They were not allowed to be imprisoned, and they could not take the fifth. You could say that corporations, in a sense, had a brain in the same way that a computer had a brain, but it didn't have a mind. That is, it could only do what it was told to do. It had no heart, no soul, no spirit, and no conscience. Corporations have not one single human attribute. A corporation is literally deaf, dumb, and blind. And more importantly, it does not have that unique human attribute. It does not have a will. And most clearly, corporations are not endowed by its creator but with any inalienable right. We are the creators of corporations, not God. Now, by the end of the 19th century, corporations, industrialization had mushroomed, and corporations had grown out of hand. This was the day of the robber barons. Corporation, the word corporation, incidentally, has as its root the same word as corpse. Corporation means body, as in corpus delicti. So these corporations got out of bounds, and the public realized that regulations and legislations were necessary in order to keep them in bounds and return to being servants of society. We needed safeguards so that corporations' behavior would coincide with good public policy. It started perhaps with Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century and his invention of the antitrust laws, the most famous of which literally dissolved John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust. It followed with child labor laws, guarantees of rights of workers to organize, the security and accounting laws, the trade laws, truth in advertising laws, the pure food and drug laws, and the rest, so that the health and safety of our economy and of ourselves was not entrusted to the heartless and selfless artificialities that we had created, but rather was entrusted to the democratically responsible powers, such as the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, the Pure Food and Drug Administration, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the bank examiners, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, OSHA, EPA, and all the rest. clear examples of the public's awareness of the need to constrain these creatures so that they would work as public servants. Now, how did these creatures that we crafted so carefully in Figure 1, an accountability system, and constrained so carefully with these regulations and legislation, how did they pervert every turn of the system? Well, it began with the deregulation mania of the last quarter of the previous century. Regulations and constraints that we had learned to be so necessary began to be weakened. Antitrust was essentially forgotten. Unions were disempowered. Pure food and drug laws lost their teeth. And the EPA and OSHA were essentially ignored. The result was the financial sector's implosion of 2007, which put the globe in a trauma from which it may or may not recover. We had had a previous financial near implosion. In 1933, for a month, there was a run on the banks. People literally lined up on the sidewalk to withdraw their funds before their bank went bankrupt. The government shut down the banks for a week in what's now called the bank holiday. And during that period passed legislation and regulations that would put the banks back on the road to being public servants. And when the banks reopened, a miracle. People had regained their confidence in the banks and were lined up on the sidewalk to redeposit the money that they had withdrawn just a couple of weeks before. Appropriate regulation and legislation had averted a financial disaster and turned the banks back into a reliant servant of the people without a single penny of bailout. Those reforms included making interstate banking illegal, requiring adequate reserves, enforcing the antitrust laws, and lo and behold, bank examiners actually examined banks. We ended up with a financial sector that was essentially sound for half a century. And then deregulation hit. The poster child of deregulation in the financial sector has got to be Lehman Brothers, America's fourth largest investment bank, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. It went bankrupt overnight. We had deregulated ourselves to financial disaster. But you will note there hasn't been a single criminal prosecution for any of the perpetrators. And even worse, we still have no effective reform of the legislation and regulation that held these creatures responsible for their service to the public for half a century. The only result so far has been $600 billion bailout to the victims of their own unregulated greed and hubris. The generally accepted accounting practices have been watered down so that accounting no longer serves its primary function, which is as a smoke alarm to tell us when trouble is brewing. However, the entire financial sector, not to mention General Motors and Chrysler, collapsed without a single warning from the accountants. The entire financial sector, house of cards, went up in smoke without a peep from the smoke alarm. The monsters are actually writing their own operating manual. And in the industrial sector, not to mention Enron, we also have General Motors and Chrysler, who received $60 billion in bailout in the automobile industry. We invented the automobile, and now we've forgotten how to make one. And yet the industrial and financial sector demands more deregulation, smaller government, and let the free market do its thing. That would be ludicrous if it weren't so tragic. Remember the checks and balances on Figure 1? They're all been perverted. Large, mature corporations no longer need their owners. They don't need their shareholders because they never sell any stock. When you buy a share of stock, every penny that you pay goes to the guy from whom you bought the stock. The corporation doesn't get a penny. It's absolutely impossible for you to invest in a large, mature corporation unless they issue new stock. They're not even serving their primary function, which was to accumulate capital. In addition to that, stock is no longer owned mostly by individuals. It's owned by the funds, the mutual funds, the index funds, the pension funds, the retirement funds, etc. And the fund managers are unwilling to call to task the management of a corporation that's mismanaging. They just sell the stock. Therefore, the management of corporations have no accountability to their owners. If selling the stock has no effect, if the portfolio manager sells stock, the corporation isn't affected. Even if that makes the price go down, the corporation isn't affected. So you don't have any proxy fights. You don't have fights for different candidates for the board of directors. There's no accountability to the stockholders. Therefore, the management of the company, in effect, appoints the board, which is the organization that elects the president, who appoints them. What a deal. And often, the president of the company is also chairman of the board. So he's chairman of the board that elects him as president. And to continue that, many officers of the corporation who are elected by the board are also members on the board, which is the organization that sets their salaries and their bonuses. Such a convoluted circus sideshow decorated with explicit conflicts of interest staggers the mind. When I sit on a witness stand as an expert and try to explain this to the jury, they're incomprehensible. They just can't believe that that's the way the modern corporate world works.
Would you say that last again?
About the witness? Or what? Which part?
And right before it, the sentence right before it.
The officers and the president who are elected by the board, the president is often chairman of the board that elects him president, and the officers of the corporation sit on the board, which is the board that elects them as officers. And the board also is the one that sets the officers and the president's salaries and bonuses. And you thought that those MRO bonuses and salaries were the gratitude of the board and generous thanks from the stockholder. You didn't think that. Okay. Is that the part? Yeah, you'll see that on Figure 2. Also, the watchdog that the stockholders have in the independent auditors, The independent auditors now are in effect appointed by the managements. When I was vice president of Gulf, we had, and was sitting at the stockholders meeting, I was sitting next to the chief financial officer, Jim Murdy. And this is a stockholders meeting now, and the chairman of the board, who was also the president, who had just been reelected president by the board that he was chairman of, it's time for the stockholders to elect the outside auditors. Jim Murdy, sitting right next to me, chief financial officer, gets up and says, "My name is Jim Murdy. I'm a stockholder of Gulf," which is true, "and I live at such and such Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, and I nominate so-and-so accounting firm to be our outside auditors." Another Gulf officer, who was also a stockholder, jumped up and seconded the motion, and we had our outside auditors elected, and it took less than 10 seconds. The watchdogs of the shareholders had become the lapdogs of management. And the government is in all kinds of difficulty trying to monitor corporations, especially the international corporations that have subsidiaries and offshore subsidiaries. And the worst trend now that I can see is the treaties that the corporations write and that the Senate and the President approves. You know already about the North American Trade Agreement. Well, the new one is even worse, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Just a couple of features of that. It has no termination date. The only way you can get out of it is if all the other member countries agree. For instance, the United States cannot get out if, for example, the Sultan of Brunei doesn't want us out, because we have to have his approval. Products shipped into the United States from any of the other countries in this agreement do not have to meet U.S. Food and Drug Administration specifications, for example. And these treaties place corporate financial interest above the laws of the foreign countries. If a U.S. corporation builds a plant in a foreign country and their minimum wage is increased, the corporation can sue that government for not being able to realize its expected profit. That's what the kind of thing you get when corporations write your treaties for you. So we have the modern corporation is become complete into itself. It's not accountable to anyone. It's self-sufficient. It's self-perpetuating. It's in effect an hereditary monarchy, accountable to no one, the quintessential monster. And at the heart of the matter is the fact that they don't serve their initial purpose, which is to accumulate capital. The Harvard Business Review published an article that I wrote that examined 50 largest corporations in the U.S. over a 10-year period. They did not issue new stock, so they're not accumulating capital. What they're living on is the portion of the profit they did not pay to the shareholders as dividends, which is euphemistically called retained earnings. Well, this study published by the Harvard Business Review showed that 16% of the retained earnings never reached the pockets of the shareholders. Not only are corporations not accumulating capital, they're destroying it. You can imagine the hate mail that I got from big corporations. Two of them. One, I had my roommate in graduate school, Bill Reels. his career and mine were almost exactly parallel throughout our whole lives. He with Texaco and me with Gulf. So I was vice president of Gulf, and he was vice president of Texaco. And Texaco did not do well at all in this analysis that I did. So he wrote me a letter. We'd kept in good communication all those years. He wrote me a letter. I've still got it. Said, "Dear Ben, I have just finished reading your terrible article." I had a lot of correspondence with the CFO of 3M, Minnesota Mining Manufacturing, who did not do well. And of course I was terrorized because every time I did all this work myself, all the analysis and data collection and everything. I was scared to death he'd turned loose half of his department to find out where my error was. Well, he never did find an error. And but we had a lot of correspondence back and forth. The last letter I got from him said, "Well, anyway, 3M's a great company to work for."
Is any of that analysis in your book?
No, but it's in the Harvard Business Review, a copy of which I happen to bring. The title of the article kind of tells it all. It's titled "The Mysterious Disappearance of Retained Earnings." And one of the headlines in it says there is no correlation between a company's earnings and the performance of its shares. A critical point that's often overlooked, to me, is the scariest of all. It's impossible for a corporation to participate in a political process with any of the kind of responsibility you would hope to find in a participant. You and I have the ability and are invited to consider such things as what's good public policy. Who's the honest candidate? Who's the most competent? Who's the most qualified? Corporations can't do that. It's not that they're unable to. It's not only that they're not able to, they're forbidden to do that. By the very nature of a corporation, every dollar it spends must be in the prospect of receiving at least $1 of something in return. A corporation only spends money for things they buy. Therefore, every contribution that they make to a political campaign must be based entirely on that single criterion. What am I going to get more than my dollar back as a result of me supporting that candidate? If a corporation didn't do that, then management would be subject to stockholder lawsuits for misfeasance, for misappropriation of funds. Corporations are world class at deciding what's profitable. I was director of economics for Gulf for a while, and I can testify corporations are expert at decision trees and utility theory and internal rate of return and discounted cash flow and so forth. I taught at Sloan School of Management at MIT for 25 years. I taught engineering economics. I taught decision theory. I wrote the book on stochastic optimization. At determining what's profitable, they're world class, but they have absolutely no capacity and no ability and no willingness to decide anything on the basis of what's right or what's just. or what's good or what's fair. When I was vice president of Gulf, for a while I spent part-time assigned to the MIT Energy Lab, which was studying national energy policy. This was back, late 70s. And the chairman of the board, who was a good friend of mine, we both had the same thesis supervisor at MIT, Jerry McAfee asked me to review a draft of the national energy policy that he was getting ready to publish as Gulf's contribution to the dialogue. Well, I looked it over pretty thoroughly and reported back to him. I said, Jerry, if every recommendation you made in this recommended national energy policy, if every recommendation you made was carried out, it wouldn't even begin to speak to the issues facing the country. And his answer was short and sweet. He says, my job isn't to solve the national energy problem. My job's to make money for Gulf. And of course he's right. That's his job.
Did he teach at Rice?
I'm sorry?
Did he teach at Rice?
No. He's a Port Arthur boy. Went to MIT, went to UOP, Universal Oil Products in Chicago, then to Gulf. No, he never taught at Rice. As far as I know, I'm pretty sure he never lived in Houston. The Supreme Court missed this point completely. As I said, it's not discussed. I don't think it's well understood. Let me quote from the majority opinion of the Supreme Court. Quote, this court now concludes that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. I told you it did not pass the giggle test. That speakers, now remember, this is the Supreme Court that says money is speech. So I'm going to substitute money for this word. Money may have influence over or access to elected officials does not mean that those officials are corrupt. And the appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in this democracy. Well, I don't know where these 5 Supreme Court justices spent their life, but where I spend my life, if a guy spends a whole lot of money getting me a job, I owe him a favor. As I read the history books, that fracas back in 1776 was mostly about how our political leaders get chosen. Since from the beginning of time until then, they were chosen by God. Remember the divine right of kings? Well, in 1776, Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and a whole bunch of those guys decided that God had been doing such a lousy job of picking their political leaders that they were going to fire him from that job and they were going to have a go at it themselves. And so we were the people. We're going to pick our own political leaders. Well, in the year 2010, the Supreme Court said, okay, since the beginning of time until 1776, God picked your leaders. From 1776 until 2010, we the people picked them. Now corporations are going to pick them. Well, to that I say a great big hell no. However poorly or well we've done the job of picking our political leaders, that's our job, and we're going to do it. And it breaks my heart that this isn't the number one issue that the public is debating. I love my move to amend button. You didn't bring any mic? You're fired. Move to amend.org and get yourself a button. Does somebody want? I sold all mine last Saturday at another Democratic meeting. Who wants my button? Okay. It gives me a great opportunity. I play a lot of duplicate bridge, and you sit down at a table and somebody says, "Move to amend what?" Well, that gives me 10 or 15 seconds to say, well, move to amend the U.S. Constitution because the Supreme Court says that corporations are people and have free speech, and money is speech, and therefore they can contribute money to political campaigns. I mean, there's the whole issue right there. 10 seconds. And they say, my God, really? The good news is everybody agrees that that's dumb. It's tragedy. The bad news is nobody knows that that's an issue. In fact, I had one woman riding in the elevator, and she saw my button. She asked if I was a real estate agent from a small town in West Texas named Amend. The establishment has just put the lid on any conversation about this as an issue. They've hushed it up. It's got to be number one. So, is this the end of our experiment to see if people can govern themselves? Ironically, we natural people created a legal fiction to serve us, and it's become a monster that will destroy us. Our government will become of, by, and for the corporations. A government of, by, and for big money. Surely if we had entered this story in Mary Shelley's contest, it would have won the prize as the most scary horror tale. But what a joyless and tragic prize that would be. In our 2 1/3 centuries of this democratic experiment, we have tried to commit national suicide twice. And ironically, in both cases, the evildoer has been the Supreme Court. Now listen carefully so you won't miss the irony. In the first national suicide attempt, of course, was over slavery. In 1857, the Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision, ruled that if you're a person and your skin happens to be black, then you're not a person, you're a thing. The second attempted national suicide attempt was on January the 21st, 2010, when the same Supreme Court ruled in its Citizens United decision, if you're a thing and you happen to have the word incorporated in your name, then you're not a thing, you're a person. Holy shit. It took a civil war in the 13th Amendment to correct the Dred Scott error. We're lucky to correct the Citizens United error. It will only take a constitutional amendment. That's necessary and imminently possible. In the 226 years since we adopted the Constitution, that Constitution has been amended 27 times. That's an average of about one amendment every 8 years. Well, the 21st Amendment, the 27th Amendment, the last amendment, was passed 21 years ago. So we're 13 years overdue for this amendment. So let's go do it. Let's make it happen. We've got to. If we don't, nothing else is going to matter. 2 things to do: sign the petition and spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions?
I believe that we had someone, was it Mike, that wants to pass out?
Yeah, before we start Q&A, I have a sheet here from Move to Amend. If you care to join the organization, we would appreciate you writing down your name and information and put you on the mailing list. And
Can I pass out those brochures that you brought?
well, they can pick those up.
Okay.
later.
Do you have a sample amendment?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you have it with you? I don't have it with me. It's on the website.
Yes.
It's beautiful. It's short. It's written so clearly that even a Supreme Court justice can understand it.
Is this a Houston-based movement, or is this a national?
No, this is
based?
national. They're based
Okay.
in California. It's growing all the time. We do monthly conference calls. Many of the western states, northern states, eastern states are starting to join in. We have a little problem with the central U.S., but that'll come along too. We have in Texas, we have an organization called Texans United to Amend. We have over 20 organizations throughout the state. Some are very small, some are just one person working in their neighborhood to advance our agenda. But we meet to have conference calls too. So the job now is to get the word out, tell people about these organizations.
There must be, I probably, after it came out, I probably signed 15 petitions online, as probably most people in this room did. So I have no idea whether I've signed your petition or not, because I've signed so many of them, everyone that's come by, because people, even though a lot of people were asleep, there are many people who were irate and upset, and have been, and not slept well since that happened. So it's, people do know.
Well, really, the main
But not enough.
the main list you want to get on if you're interested is to go to movetoamend.org and fill out their sign their support petition. Then you'll be on the national mailing list. You'll hear about national events going around. We're going to have a convergence, a state meeting in Austin in October, which people will be coming in from hopefully around Texas and maybe surrounding states to learn about the program and how to organize in their communities. The sign up today is mostly for our local purposes. We sometimes have a difficult time getting this list read correctly. When people write down their email list, it's awfully hard to decipher. So, like I say, if you are interested, please go to movetoamend.org and do the sign up there. But I'll pass this around for anybody.
You asked about the sample. It's on the web, and it's 100 words, maybe at the most. 2 articles. The first says, corporations are not people, and they have no rights that we don't explicitly give them.
Great.
The second is, money is not speech. That's it.
Well, that second one, I think, is a crucial one because it attacks more than just corporations. It also attacks people like the Koch brothers, who are not a corporation and spend tons of money on political campaigns. It gives the government the ability to control spending in political races.
Exactly. And if we don't get clean elections, I'm moving to Bora Bora. Yeah.
I would like to see somewhere the people involved in this, because I realize the Supreme Court, ultimately ruled on this, but somebody had to be pushing this. It didn't just, materialize overnight on its own.
Move to amend, you mean?
No, the Supreme Court decision.
No, I mean corporations taking over our government and owning all of our legislatures and, government officials. I mean, that didn't just happen overnight, and it didn't happen just because the Supreme Court ruled on it.
Well, okay.
So there must be a
Well,
history.
that's what I tried to outline. We had the corporations got out of hand at the turn of the century, and we brought them back. And that worked for half a century, from 1930 to 1980. That's something. And then the first thing that happened was we shut down the antitrust division of the U.S. Justice Department. And we might as well have. They don't do anything. I've got another lecture on that subject. We went from 30 some, I forget the numbers, from 30 some odd banks to what is it now, 4? And one of them is under criminal indictment. Airlines went from 30 or 40 to 4 or 5. The Big 8 is now what, John, the Big 4? The really Big 4. Antitrust, all the legislation and regulations that we know we have to contain corporations that were developed in the first third of this century are gone. And corporations, in Corton's book, When Corporations Rule the World, it's been an evolution, and it's taken over the last 30 years. When I worked I'm ashamed to be a businessman in today's world, I must tell you. When I spent 30 years with one of the biggest corporations in the world, and I'm proud of every minute of it. We paid our bills, we behaved ourselves. I remember we were coming in on a company plane, I think it was to Houston, at Hobby, back in the days, when Hobby was a private airport, or maybe it was Love Field in Dallas. Anyway, it was a small airport on the company plane, and it bumped just before we hit the ground. And there was another vice president on it with me. And the next day, Bob Brown, heard on the radio that a farmer truck cab had been dented on a road running beside the airport. And he said, that was that bump. And I said, yeah. So we called the law department and said, hey, our plane bumped that car. And the lawyer said, oh, they'll never be able to track it. And man, did we get mad. I mean, we hit that cab, go find out who was driving it, and let's make it right. Where do you see that kind of behavior today?
Ben, what happened was things got very complex corporate-wise, not only financially, but also in pushing the envelope of corporations. And they got so complex that you had financial instruments that no one ever heard of before, and they pushed the ethical envelope. So when you say, no one was arrested, well, that's because what happened was it was unethical, but it wasn't illegal.
Right.
And they will always push that ethical envelope, or they'll be fired and they'll get someone else who will. It's that regulation and it's that oversight that matters the most.
Absolutely. If you don't have it, they're going to rule the world.
Well, they don't have, look, we've got still 65-70% of employment in this nation is through small and medium businesses. But corporations now, with the Super PAC and the Citizens United, what you have is the ability to pay for any advertisement that can, but that's not necessarily a win for the candidate, because what happens is action has reaction. Another party comes up, and you saw what just happened in the 2012 elections. Billions of dollars is now in place at both sides fighting each other, and the media loves it. because they collect the money for it. So there is an offset somewhat, but see, in a vacuum, what the Supreme Court did was, in their legal minds, in a vacuum, said that I can't restrict a person's how he spends his money. Now, you can stand for that, right? Unless it's illegal, you're spending your money. But if I want to spend my money to do something, so I can see in their vacuum. But what they didn't take into consideration was the unbelievable power that is in the hands of a few.
That's right. With no accountability.
No.
None. Absolutely
And
none.
5014C, none.
Yeah.
No, so you're talking
John?
about taxation.
I've got a question on
Yeah.
Texas. Texas has had a law that corporations could not make political contributions. And I don't know what this Supreme Court decision.
It reverses that law.
Well,
I'm no lawyer, but it invalidates